Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, the second part of our examination of the essay from the very famous prison notebooks by the great Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci. And today we are considering the second part of that particular essay, which deals with some of the examples of the formation of intellectual groups, or the groups of intellectuals that by the bourgeoisie during their rise to power and their contending for power with the feudal aristocracy. And I didn't get time to do some of this last week, but it's an important series of issues that he raises and pieces of analysis. So I'm going to go through this for the next hour or so tonight. So it's outside of the normal broadcast, as I made clear last week. This is the first in an ongoing series of programs covering the work of Gramsci, because I think that it's crucial to understand the revolutionary implications of the work of this great Marxist thinker. And he has been claimed by all manner of charlatans for far too long. So we will begin then by just recapping what we looked at last week, which is that the way in which Gramsci analyzes the intellectuals as a group, as a section within the what you would call the superstructure of the state organization, of the mode of production. And what he makes clear right at the beginning of the essay is that the intellectuals, of course, include all manner of the bourgeois themselves, who Gramsci makes clear are very much part of the intellectual production for the bourgeoisie, because they are experts in the management of, for instance, factory life, the life of an enterprise. They contribute towards the intellectual life of their class through their expertise in the field of production, but also through their replication of and their buying into, through their class interests, bourgeois ideology. So Gramsci, from the very beginning of the essay, is making it clear that the term intellectual has to cover a much broader and all-encompassing understanding of what intellectual life is, of what intellectual production is, of who can be an intellectual, who is an intellectual. Because the way in which, of course, this is traditionally portrayed is that the intellectual is the rather pencil-necked man poring over a book with a pair of spectacles on. And Gramsci's point is that he is, without using so many words, because as we said, we were talking about last week, the way in which Gramsci had to write these essays was, of course, subjected to the ever-present eye of the prison censor. So he didn't use a lot of Marxist terms in doing so. But what he means when he's pointing out the role that the bourgeois themselves, the role that the capitalist plays in being part of the intellectual life of his class, is that this is about the production and reproduction of bourgeois ideology. And so therefore that requires a much broader definition of what an intellectual is than that which bourgeois ideology itself would have us believe. So it consists of the various elements in the bourgeois themselves, who have certain forms of industrial and commercial expertise, but also who are engaged in the process of reproducing bourgeois. Talks about the intellectuals as a group. Of course, he is referring to the superstructure of society. He's referring to the different areas that produce and reproduce bourgeois ideology. And that means, of course, you need this broader definition to understand it. And the role of the intellectuals, as he makes clear, of course, changes under different modes of production. He is talking about the examples that come from his own home nation of Italy, in the form of how the feudal aristocracy used to draw into its intellectual sphere. It used to draw from the southern Italian particularly southern Italian, peasantry, and that the peasantry provided a lot of the intellectuals for the Italian kingdoms in the feudal period. And the same was true for a long time, of course, in all of the Christian nations of Europe. If you were a peasant, one of the few ways in which your sons in particular could make a better life for themselves, and one of the few ways that existed in that period of time to get elevated up the social ladder, was to have a son who would join the priesthood and, of course, do well there. Because if you joined the priesthood and you were in any way successful, you would at least have your own church, you would at least have your own parish, you would have a status within any particular community that is elevated far beyond, of course, the average life of an Italian peasant in the feudal period, and up to the very much up to the period that Gramsci was actually writing, because the church in the 1920s and early 1930s still had a very important role in the Italian society. So that was something that was a very interesting angle there to explore. And of course, you can also look at it here in terms of in Britain, in terms of how the production of intellectuals, that particular layer of intellectuals, changed with the state takeover of the Catholic Church, which is essentially what the religious changes under Henry VIII consisted of. Henry VIII, of course, died a good Catholic. He died apparently clutching his rosary and praying in Latin, but he made himself the head of the English Church. And, of course, this was done partly for personal reasons, but mostly it was done for political reasons. It was done because of the long-term transformation of the mode of production in feudal England into capitalism. And this, as Marx chronicles in Capital Volume 1, this arguably begins as early as the 11th century, but there's a definitive break in that the feudal power was irrevocably damaged by a number of incidents from the 11th century onwards. But the big break comes from the defeat of the Yorkists, the House of York, in what effectively is a civil war in feudal Britain, and you get the rise of the families from which Henry VIII would spring. They're coming from, of course, the allegiance of the House of Lancaster. So you get the reign of Henry VII, who made several changes to strip the feudal lords in Britain of their traditional powers, particularly their power to keep a huge amount of armed retainers. And he also instituted several pieces of land reform, which would be taken far further by his son. Now, with regard to the intellectuals, what Henry VIII does, which is crucial to understand, or maybe I need to put it better, what Henry VIII is motivated to carry out by others in his court, namely people like Thomas Cromwell and other pro-Reformation reformers in his immediate presence. So what the reign of Henry VIII symbolizes, of course, is, of course, the takeover by the English state of the church. And therefore, and this relates back to the question of the intellectuals, that layer of priests, which is employed by the church, of course, had to be purged. Those loyal to the Pope in Rome were shown the door, or worse. And, of course, the extensive lands that the church had were, a lot of them anyway, were confiscated by the state and sold off to private bidders, which is how you get a new layer of petty bourgeois and bourgeois landowners buying up land who weren't part of the traditional hereditary feudal aristocracy, who were small traders, merchants, etc., people from the towns who bought up church land and who then farmed it in new ways that were much less related to the sort of semi-feudal relations that existed on the land prior to the Reformation and the seizure of the church lands. That is where, of course, the family of the later Oliver Cromwell came from, in terms of they were not nobility. He was a distant relation of Thomas Cromwell, but I think it was something like a third cousin twice removed or something ridiculous. But his family, Cromwell's family, bought up a certain amount of land. He was a small landowner in what's called East Anglia. Now, in terms of going back to the intellectuals and what this meant, what this means in terms of the development of the English state is that now the English state is centralizing power in and around the figure of the monarch, which is a phase through which British and, to a certain extent, French capitalism were to go through. You go from the dispersed power of high period feudalism. So if you look at like France or England prior to the Reformation, if you look at high feudal period Germany, again prior to the rise of Martin Luther, and also places like Italy, of course, fractured into many princely states, often competing against each other. But if you look at England, for instance, prior to the Wars of the Roses, which was one of the big hammer blows that was to reduce the power of feudalism, you did have a relatively dispersed system of power. Kings were only as powerful as the big landowners would allow them to be. If the landowners got together and were able to agree upon a certain program, particularly the most powerful landowners, it was a rare thing indeed to have a king that could resist them. And what the Wars of the Roses and various other conflicts that broke out immediately before that symbolize is a breaking down of that old order, which was always one step away from descending into violence due to the competing interests of the feudal barons. But the destructiveness of the great wars of between the houses of York and Lancaster demonstrated that the feudal order was coming to pieces. Like it was no longer capable of resolving its disputes in a way that wasn't extremely violent, without a resort to all-out warfare that lasted for decades and went back and forth between various different aristocratic coalitions. What comes about, though, partly through all of this, is the consolidation of power around the figure of an absolute monarch, where the power of the feudal aristocracy is curtailed bit by bit by bit. So Henry VII does that through some reforms. Henry VIII destroys the power of the church, because the church is an external force, essentially. The Pope in Rome was a very real commander of various different papal states. There was at various different times quite a powerful papal army. And also in terms of what we're talking about here, which is ideology, the Catholic belief system and the ability of the Pope to appoint and control various different levels within the the English Church, of course, gave a lot of power to external actors in English political life. External actors by that, not just meaning the popes and the papacy, but who controlled the papacy. So back in the 14th, 15th centuries, you're looking at the power of sometimes the King of Spain, sometimes the King of France, who were the more powerful feudal monarchs, certainly more powerful in many ways than the kings of England, and their ability to place a pope on the papal throne, so to speak, gave them a lot of influence over internal political life in the other Catholic nations. And this is certainly a threat, and regarded as a threat by the rising English bourgeoisie in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. They start to view the papacy as imposing things, and the Reformation, of course, brings this to a head. And so one of the motivations they have for doing an English version of the Reformation, they didn't want the chaos that a sort of Martin Luther or Thomas Müntzer, a sort of revolutionary process, would unleash, but they wanted to get control of one of the key centers of ideological production. and so you take over the running of the Catholic Church. If you look at how the Anglican Church is structured, even right down to the way in which the churches are laid out, the way in which the services are conducted, the way the architecture looks, it's still basically just an English national version of Catholicism, which always created problems in terms of the relationship between some of the more radical Protestant groups and the established church, which of course came to a head during the period of the English Civil War. But so one of the advantages, and Gramsci goes into this in this part of the book, that England and then later Britain has going into the 17th century in the period of the English Civil War is that it has created a form of absolutism after the rule of Henry VIII. The feudal barons still had a bit of power. They had the ability to make some trouble, but nothing like what they had. You have a concentration of power around the figure of the monarch and, of course, their immediate advisors. And this was something that was very much welcomed by the intellectuals of the time. So, for instance, Francis Bacon, a very prominent intellectual philosopher and scientist in the early 17th century, welcomed absolutism because he said that an inspired absolute ruler would help take the country forward. And this is the system that was built by these sort of early bourgeoisie, the early English bourgeoisie, mainly merchants and bankers and people who were making their money setting up the earliest stages of manufacturing, what would become capitalist manufacturing, particularly in London, but also those who are making money out of the early colonial period in the 16th and early 17th century. So in that period, the intellectual production was very much about justifying absolutism. Of course, you then get a change when the power of the absolutist state runs into the interests of the rising bourgeois, and the rising bourgeois deliver a defeat to absolutism. And there's a lot of contesting all the way through the 1640s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, until finally they reach a solution. And this is what Gramsci talks about in this particular section of the work, where Gramsci talks about how, and I'm going to read the quote out to you now, the new social grouping, and he's referring to the English bourgeois here, that grew up on the basis of modern industrialism shows a remarkable economic corporate development, but advances only gropingly in the intellectual political field. There is a very extensive category of organic intellectuals, those, that is, who come into existence on the same industrial terrain as the economic group. But in the higher sphere, we find that the old landowning class preserves its position of virtual monopoly. It loses its economic supremacy, but maintains for a long time a politico-intellectual supremacy, and is assimilated as traditional intellectuals and as a directive group by the new group in power. The old landowning aristocracy is joined to the industrialists by a kind of suture, which is precisely that which in other countries unites the traditional intellectuals with the new dominant classes. So what he's referring to here is that in England and then later in Britain, you have in the formation of the new state after the revolutionary processes of the 1640s, the revolutionary dictatorship of Cromwell, which ran up to 1660, the restoration period of the House of Stuart, which is 1660 to 1688. And then you get the long period of contestation between the different aristocratic houses over the throne between 1689 and 1745. So by the time that the state had stabilized, as I've said on many occasions, you had, it was almost, in total, it was about 107, 108 years to reach a stable outcome for the English bourgeois. Again, that's something they always forget. But what Gramsci's referring to here is that he's saying that the organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie are very powerful in the economic sphere, but in the political and intellectual environment, they needed to make a deal with the old feudal aristocracy. And they did this partly because they had been, and The historian Christopher Hill covers this in his book Century of Revolution, partly because the bourgeois had been burnt by the radicalization process that had gone on amidst the peasantry and elements of the early proletariat in the English Civil War and the English Revolution. And this, of course, manifested itself through things like the Putney debates, the debates between the radicals within the New Model Army and the army commanders, where one of the commanders, Cromwell's son-in-law, a man named Henry Ireton, basically told the levelers that we've got the property, we've got the power. And if you don't have a stake in the country, i.e. property ownership, then you don't have political rights. That's how many of them still think. Ireton was just being a bit more honest. But what it did was, because there was so many radical groups emerging amongst the subordinated classes of the early proletariat and the peasantry, the English bourgeois got frightened by that revolutionary process, which is why they couldn't agree upon a constitutional settlement, because some of them, a minority of them, wanted to institute some form of democratic rule. The bulk of them, though, had been terrified by the uprisings from the lower classes and wanted just stability at any cost. They wanted rid of the king because he'd proved himself to be too unreasonable. He wouldn't negotiate with them. So they needed to get rid of him, but they couldn't agree what form of state they wanted next. So Cromwell's revolutionary dictatorship was there to push through a number of legal changes that the bourgeoisie want, to change the nature of the state, to make it more in line with bourgeois interests. They then did a deal when Cromwell died and his useless idiot son, Richard Cromwell, agreed to fuck off into exile in return for his gambling debts being paid off. The army commanders, led by a guy called George Monk, did a deal with Charles II, the late king's eldest son, who agreed to come back and take up the throne again. Now, why is this? And this is why the English class, the formation of the English ruling class, is always misinterpreted by many people in England and a lot of people externally. A lot of people think that the aristocracy didn't go away. What happened was, as Gramsci intimates in that passage I've just read out, the aristocracy in the form of the king were repurposed. They were repurposed by the bourgeoisie, who brought back Charles II, who was interested in screwing as many women as he could find and creating a whole army of bastards. But his brother, James, because Charles II had no legitimate heir, so his younger brother, James II, the last Stuart monarch, gets given the throne. However, James has aspirations because they haven't changed the constitution as such. The bourgeoisie have restored the monarchy, thinking that, right, well, we've got to deal with these characters now. They know not to impinge upon our interests. They know that they shouldn't be levying taxes without calling a parliament. They know that they can't be raising armies without consulting us. They're under control. But James, of course, had the same tendencies as his father, which is that he saw that he was appointed by God, and therefore, by the holy remit handed to him by the Almighty, he had the duty to rule. And of course, the bourgeoisie didn't want any of that. So as soon as the opportunity arose, they got rid of James II, and they brought in more pliable monarchs in the form of William of Orange and Mary, who was, of course, a daughter of, I believe it was James I. And, no, sorry, it was Charles I. Charles I's daughter, who'd married the Prince of Orange. So they bring him in because he's willing to accept the role of constitutional monarch, meaning he has power in name only, meaning that he is allowed to do certain things as long as, of course, he does it in consultation with the politicians of the bourgeoisie. So what you get then is the full repurposing of the aristocracy, which is largely completed by the 1740s. The last aristocratic rebels were defeated at Culloden, the Battle of Culloden in Scotland, with the guy called by the name of Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the grandson of James II. His father, who was the Old Pretender, he was called, had tried to raise armies and invade in the 1690s and the early 1700s. His son, Bonnie Prince Charlie, who there was, by the way, a later plot to offer Charlie the throne of America, but that's another story. He was trying to contend for the throne. He launched an invasion backed by the French, claimed the allegiance of the Highland clans through his lineage as a Scottish noble, because of course the Stuart kings came from Scotland and they were the ones who originally unified the crowns of England and Scotland. That's why I have no time for Scottish nationalists. You gave us ultimately the royal houses that have sat on the throne for the last 400 years. But I digress. So the winning of that battle marks the end point of the period of revolution and counter-revolution in what's now Britain, because you've got the official union of the crowns. The Scottish ruling class had bankrupted themselves trying to colonize Panama. It hadn't gone well. They needed to hook up with the English bourgeoisie. And what you notice is that the pattern of the feudal aristocracy providing the intellectuals for the state and the education system and the church in particular was mirrored almost exactly by the way in which the Scottish bourgeois provided an awful lot of military and political leadership in the unified state of, well, the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, as it was called. And this, of course, is ignored by Scottish nationalists these days. But the crucial thing here, as Gramsci is talking about, is the repurposing of these the feudal aristocrats. They may be called Lord Cameron, Lord MacDougall, etc. There may be the Earl of Oxford, or sometimes the Duke of Kent and stuff like that. They have all these titles which can appear to be like feudal throwbacks, but what this is a very clever way of the bourgeoisie claiming that the eternal legitimacy for themselves. They repurpose the aristocracy to serve their class needs. And so they keep the king on the throne. They have the government is run by aristocrats for a long time, but these are aristocrats who are no longer operating on the basis of the feudal mode of production. Yes, they are still quite powerful as landowners, but it's not serfdom that they're running on their lands. It's various forms of wage labor. Sometimes you get different areas of the country that still have like indentured servants in them, but serfdom as a whole is long gone. And more as time goes on through the 18th and into the 19th century, it's more and more the case that the aristocracy is employing gangs of wage laborers to work on the land, not people who are tied to the land. Marx chronicles it in Capital Volume 1, where he talks about the mode of production in agriculture, about how the English bourgeoisie on the land is always pushing for more and more efficient usage of labor through the 19th century. So they are, of course, employing the likes of large gangs of often Irish laborers as cheaply as possible to work and be hyper-exploited on the land, and it's done by the basis of wage labor. So you may be looking at what you think is a continually existing aristocracy that's been there since the time of, Edward the Confessor, pre-1066, but in actual fact, the form might look the same. The content, the class content, has completely changed. And this is what many people haven't understood. This is a great trick that the English ruling class has pulled. Now, Gramsci compares this to the way in which other states developed. And he particularly compares it to the development of capitalism in Germany. Now, Germany, of course, if you've read any of the work of Marx and Engels through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, up to the unification of Germany, but certainly in the 1840s and 50s, given that these two men were formed by their often rather frustrating experiences in the bourgeois revolutions in Germany. They both viewed Germany as being heavily pregnant with the conditions that would make for a successful bourgeois revolution, and both of them were very much involved in trying to bring that about. But they were both, of course, Marx and Engels, disgusted by the feebleness and the cowardice, as they saw it at the time, of the bourgeoisie in the various German states. They're cringing and cowering before the Prussian king and later before Bismarck and the Junkers. Now, why was that the case? And just as a side note for a while, you have to examine what Marx and Engels said about this. And they said that the way in which this happened was because that the bourgeoisie in Germany turned out to be far more afraid of the German proletariat and peasantry than they were of the feudal reactionaries in Germany, the Junker class, the Prussian king. They were way more afraid of the lower orders in Germany than they were of them. So what you get in Germany is a peculiar bourgeois revolution, which is where there is a much more of a bargain struck between the previous ruling class, epitomized in so many ways by Otto von Bismarck and his caste of Junkers, and the bourgeoisie. And Gramsci covers this in an extensive quote, which I will read to you now. Quote begins as follows. Industrial development took place within a semi-feudal integument that persisted up to November 1918, and the Junkers preserved a politico-intellectual supremacy considerably greater even than that of the corresponding group in England. They were the traditional intellectuals of the German industrialists, but retained special privileges and a strong consciousness of being an independent social group, based on the fact they held considerable economic power over the land, which was more productive than in England. The Prussian Junkers resemble a priestly military caste, with a virtual monopoly of directive organizational functions in political society, but possessing at the same time an economic base of its own, and so not exclusively dependent on the liberality of the dominant economic group. Furthermore, unlike the English landowning aristocracy, the Junkers constituted the officer class of a large standing army, which gave them solid organizational cadre, favoring the preservation of an esprit de corps and of their political monopoly. So what he's describing there is, of course, the process by which the modern German state of that era was created, which was this bargain that is struck between the rising German bourgeois, and which exists, of course, largely in places like Prussia and the more developed, especially North German states, and the Prussian Junker class, the people who, as Gramsci says in that quote, had been and always been the landowning class in Prussia, but also been the dominant group in the officer corps of the very powerful Prussian army. And so in order to secure themselves, and remember, the German ruling class, the up-and-coming bourgeoisie, is far more terrified of the early proletariat in Germany and the peasantry than they are of anything else. So they had a taste of revolution in 1848, not just in the German states, but also in places like Austria-Hungary, and they decided they didn't want any more of that. So they reached a bargain with Bismarck ultimately, and it's Bismarck's unification of Germany, which of course takes place in coalition between himself and his class of Junkers and the German bourgeoisie. And so Germany is unified on the basis of capitalism, but also on the basis that the people running the state were in partnership with the capitalists, but still slightly separate from them. So there was still, the Junkers retained, as Gramsci argues here, a degree of independence for their class, far longer than the English aristocracy. The English aristocracy had been completely repurposed by the middle of the 18th century. Any remaining power they had over the economy and state was removed by the abolition of the Corn Laws later on in the middle of the 19th century. And that was done specifically to be able to bring in corn and other agricultural products at lower prices than that which the landowners were willing and able to actually provide. And this, of course, is very famous in my home city, Manchester. You got plenty of statues to people like Richard Cobden and John Bright, who were the leaders of the Anti-Corn Law League. So the anti-corn law agitation and ultimately the passing of legislation to repeal the corn laws, which was an old protectionist measure which worked to protect the revenue of the landowning class by restricting what could be imported into the country. Well, the Anti-Corn Law League got rid of that in the name of free trade. So any remaining residual power they had on the economic level had gone by the end of the 1850s. And of course, that split the Conservative Party because that had been a repository for like the tiny remaining remnants of aristocratic power as power expressed via their domination of the land and their land ownership. That all went by, actually it was the end of the 1840s, which causes Sir Robert Peel, another local man to this part of the world, to reform the old Tory party because it had fractured to pieces when the Corn Laws were abolished and it split apart. So in Germany, of course, that doesn't happen to the same degree. The Junkers retained a big degree of influence over the state, and the strange sort of hybrid this creates lasts until 1918, which is that the Junkers run the army and they have a very big influence over the state. They are obliged to go along with what the bourgeois want in the form of industrialization, which of course the Junkers are suspicious of. So Bismarck, as long-term chancellor of the unified Germany, and before that Prussia, is obliged to go along with this industrialization, which he's never entirely happy about, but he's also obliged to go along with and embrace things like what's referred to as the scramble for Africa and the building of a German overseas empire, which Bismarck, according to which biographer you read of him, was somewhat suspicious of. He didn't think it was a particularly good idea, but you see in like a lot of these lash-ups that you get in Central and Eastern Europe between a rising capitalist class. You got this in Russia as well, and the old aristocracy, that the old aristocracy has to bend to the will of the capitalist class. Like the people in Russia, for instance, who were most rabidly in favor of Russian expansion into around the Black Sea region and also obtaining more land to hyper-exploit in Eastern Europe, were some of the aristocracy, but the main push was coming from the Russian bourgeois themselves. They were the ones who were desperate for Russian expansion in a colonial fashion. So this formation between this partnership between the Junkers and the German capitalist class gives birth ultimately to German imperialism, and of course was always criticized by Marx, Engels, and then Lenin for, of course, creating the unique combination that was to be known as German militarism, bureaucratism, and it was the feelings of Marx and Engels towards the Prussians were not favorable, I think it's fair to say. But this is, of course, a form of formation of the capitalist state which is markedly different to the way in which it was done in England, which is that the English bourgeois, in terms of their economic revolution and their political revolution, were a lot more thoroughgoing in that they destroyed the influence of the feudal aristocracy in terms of their dominance of the land and repurposed them completely to be a capitalist aristocracy. And again, this causes a lot of confusion, a lot of dumb theories to emerge about the fact that Britain's still a monarchy and that there's still this aristocracy there. No, these people are all servants of the bourgeoisie now and have been for a very long time. And they provide and have provided for a long time key elements to bourgeois ideology. And they were part of what the constitutionalist Walter Bagehot called the dignified sections of the state, meaning they're the sections of the state which are presented outside of the class to especially the subordinated classes, the workers, the proletariat, and to a certain extent sections of the petty bourgeoisie. And they are presented as God's chosen representatives. The way in which the bourgeois ideology works in this country to this day is to show that all of those in power are part of a continually existing form of governance that stretches all the way back to the time of Edward the Confessor, who promised the throne actually to a number of different people, but let's not go there, but who promised the throne to William the Conqueror, and all of the monarchies, all the monarchs that have existed trace their lineage back to him, and it's one long and glorious Anglo-Saxon development of freedom all the way up to this point in time, and aren't we lucky to live here, etc., etc. And the retention of monarchy and aristocracy is meant to do that. It's meant to convince you that this is one long, unending process that we're in. And you're meant to ignore the incredibly violent civil wars, the huge amount of death that was created in these clashes between the aristocracy when they were on the way down, or the gigantic amount of chaos that was created by the Civil War and Revolution in the 17th century and 18th centuries, or the fact that the aristocracy were completely reoriented by the bourgeoisie. So in many ways, even though of course we retain these titles and these sort of relics of feudalism, the English bourgeois revolution, I would say, was incredibly successful in that it repurposed its enemies. And this is a thing that the British ruling class do many, many times when it comes to imperialism and colonial occupations. They always seek to repurpose their enemies to become their servants, because it worked so well. It did. It worked incredibly well for them in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So when it came to colonization, and when it came to the need urgently to come to new arrangements, what they always sought to do is, having thrown anti-colonial leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in prison, was to then repurpose them and have them serve British imperialism. They were offered the chance to come out of jail. You could take up the Prime Minister's post. You could even keep the name of your party to be some sort of socialist thing if you wanted to. But, well, here's a commercial contract giving us control of all the gold mines, Mr. Nkrumah, you better sign it. And if you don't, well, it's coup time. So this is always something that the British ruling class like to do. They prefer to repurpose something and turn it to their advantage than engage in the process of just simply overthrowing it and putting something else in its place. They think it's far easier to repurpose something. Suits their purposes better. So this is, of course, true of their occupation and exploitation of India, for instance, up to, of course, the 1850s and the first Indian War of Independence, was that the British imperialists ruled through the East India Company, which in turn sought to subordinate and repurpose Indian aristocrats to do a lot of their dirty work for them, turning these people against each other, exploiting local divisions, and then ruling via these sort of puppet rajas, maharajas, etc. And this was, again, a very old and tested technique of British imperialism. Of course, it goes wrong when there's an enormous uprising and the British are obliged to impose direct rule themselves across most of India, though they still tried to exercise a lot of local power through small to medium landowners who would be answerable to the British authorities. So this all comes from this period where the intellectuals of the new order were created out of the fallen elements of the old, and that's a very interesting way to sort of look at these questions, and it's to study the early formations of the intellectual layers in the different capitalist states and tell you an awful lot about them. And of course the system in Germany, which we were talking about just a moment ago, was destroyed completely by the first inter-imperialist war. Interestingly enough, the way in which the old German Empire was constructed in terms of the internal politics of it, was devolved to such a degree that you, of course, retained the regional kings. So there was still a king of Bavaria. There was still formally a king of Prussia, a king of places like Saxony. And these individual kings, by the outbreak of World War One, still had armies of their own. So the idea of a unified German imperial army came about through World War One. But at the beginning of World War One, you still had the different armies of the different princely states that made up this German Empire, which is much more of a confederation with Prussia in a leading role than it was a sort of unified singular state. So that's another interesting detail of the state formation of modern, or the Germany of the time, shall we say. So I'll go back now to another point that Gramsci makes, and this one is specifically about political parties. And this, of course, calls to mind his later work on political parties through things like The Modern Prince, which I will be coming to later on in this series. So I'll read the next quote out, and it's quite extensive, so pull up your popcorn if you've got any. And a quote reads as follows. The political party for some social groups is nothing other than the specific way of elaborating their own category of organic intellectuals directly in the political and philosophical field, and not just in the field of productive technique. These intellectuals are formed in this way, and cannot indeed be formed in any other way, given the central character and the conditions of formation, life, and the development of the social group. Point 2. The political party, for all groups, is precisely the mechanism which carries out in civil society the same function as the state carries out more synthetically and over a larger scale in political society. In other words, it is responsible for welding together the organic intellectuals of a given group, the dominant one, and the traditional intellectuals. The party carries out this function in strict dependence on its basic function, which is that of elaborating its own component parts, those elements of a social group which has been born and developed as an economic group, and of turning them into qualified political intellectuals, leaders and organizers of all activities and functions inherent in the organic development of an integral society, both civil and political. Indeed, it can be said that within its field the political party accomplishes its function more competently and organically than the state does within its admittedly far larger field. An intellectual who joins the political party and of a particular social group is merged with the organic intellectuals of the group itself, and is linked tightly with this group. This takes place through participation in the life of the state only to a limited degree, and often not at all. Indeed, it happens that many intellectuals think that they are the state, a belief which, given the magnitude of the category, occasionally has important consequences and leads to unpleasant complications for the fundamental economic group, which it really is the state. So I wanted to revisit that quote. We did touch on it last week, but I wanted to revisit it, particularly with reference to communist parties. So the way in which the intellectuals relate to the state. Now, the state under as a workers' state, shall we say, in its early period, of course, is something which is a series of institutions and administrative institutions. And if you study the way in which the state was run in the early to middle period of the Soviet Union, you can see where some of the problems for the Soviet Union actually arose, which is that you have the party, as Gramsci says there, and he's talking, I think, as much about communist parties as he is about the way in which the state and the capitalist state is formed. But our point here is that we're looking at the communist side of things. So the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, or indeed in any workers' state, has the role perhaps a more important intellectual role than the state, which is that the party has to act as an institution that is going to not just run the state on behalf of the working class, but also to be able to effectively defend the state. Then the party has to act as a system of intellectual production. And what we mean by that is that the party has to retain an element of dynamism and an element of a strong element of creativity here. And the failures within the Soviet period and within the Eastern European people's democracies and in Tito-white Yugoslavia show us the dangers of when the party it becomes too complacent, when it stops the process of struggle. Now, what many, including Jean-Paul Sartre in his most fascinating book, Critique of Dialectical Reason, have pointed out, and this is of course pointed out by great revolutionary leaders as well, such as Stalin himself, Mao, and I think most effectively by Kim Il-sung of the DPRK. The party has to keep itself in a position where it is constantly engaged in a struggle. Now, it's a different form of struggle in the period of the workers' state. And it's what it needs to be doing constantly, as Gramsci implies there in the quotation I've just read. It needs to form a layer of an organic layer of intellectuals within the working class and bring them into the party and make them into what Kim Il-sung referred to as the hardcore. And it needs to be doing so by drawing from all the different layers of the working class in order to make sure that the party itself remains a overwhelmingly working class party, that it is taking and recruiting people from the working class to be ideologically trained, to become, to go back to their communities and their workplaces and become the foundation for the party in that particular community and workplace. And it is through the party, even more so than the state, that the process of intellectual production and reproduction under a workers' state has to start with. The party has to be the strongest element here. The failure of the Communist Party on an intellectual level in the Soviet Union and the people's democracies is a massive part of their decline and fall. Of course, that stems from a problem on an economic level, which is the creeping back in of capitalist relations of production. But again, you can possibly address that, or at least counterbalance it, by having a strong enough intellectual tradition in the party to at least be able to counteract the damaging effects of problems in the economic sphere. So the party has to be central to the creation of strong cadres, as not Gramsci doesn't refer to them as that, but Che Guevara does in his work, and Kim Il-sung does as well, and Stalin does. And to take it a little bit further, so you've got the need for the party to be constantly refreshing itself by drawing in new layers and being able to train new working class leaders who are going to go back and organize in their workplace, in their community, organize the party's activities, make sure that the party is constantly engaged in leading struggles that still do exist in all of these different working class areas. The struggle to struggle for victorious socialism is one that's going to take place over many, many generations. The party has to constantly be renewed. But more than that, to, again, go into something that Kim Il-sung said, the party has to have its hardcores, but also you need to then extend that once the party is healthy enough to defend the workers' state and have enough working class leaders within it, leaders on a local workplace community level, who are strong enough to carry out the democratic will of the party, but also then you have to spread that out into then, as far as you can, the organs of the state. So you have to have proper intellectual layers who are not only who in the state itself. So you start by getting the party right, but to draw on Kim Il-sung's work, you then have to get the organization of the state right, and you have to get the organization of the different elements of the state right as well. And that means, of course, extending this thinking that you apply to the party to the whole state, meaning that not only do you have to have good technical administrative personnel in all the key roles and find the right people for that by recruiting from as wide a layer as possible, you also have to make sure that these are people who are committed to the revolutionary process, who are good, not just good administrators who can be watched by, say, political representatives of the party, but you need within these state organizations a strong amount of revolutionary cadre who are, again, combine the role of capable administrators who can run the state, but who are tied as far as you can to the party and the class. The same is true for the organization of trade unions. These are all institutions which can be subject to atrophy under a workers' state, and this happened to some degree in all of the Eastern European states and the Soviet Union. But you have to keep all of them in touch with the class, and you have to have it to be able to properly enact the mass line. Of course, you have to have any gap between the broad working class masses and the party and the state and the trade unions. You have to close that gap as far as you possibly can. And it's a constant struggle to keep creating and recreating strong cadre in the party and strong intellectual layers within the party and the state and the trade unions. And to go back to what Gramsci is saying here, this is the way in which we have to regard intellectuals as communists. So going right the way back to how he started the chapter, if we take the Marxist understanding that Gramsci is putting forward about intellectuals, which is that it's not just about philosophizing or artistry, though those are parts of it. It's also about understanding the way that technical production is organized, or understanding things like finance, understanding all these different elements that you need to master, or you need to have a group master in order to properly run a state, properly run a mode of production. You need to have this understanding of what intellectual production is. And of course, all of this, when you take it from the technical and administrative level up to the levels in the superstructure that do deal with culture and what you might more typically think of as ideology, all of this has to be understood properly by communists when seeking to construct a workers' state. And if it's not, then you end up with a neglect of one area or another. You either neglect the technical side of it and you overly favor the political side of it, or you neglect the political side and just favor the bureaucratic and administrative side. And what you find, and this goes back to an understanding of Lenin's work and Marx as well, and even before that, it's there in Hegel, it's there in, I've been reading Clausewitz recently, as you may know if you've followed the Telegram channel. It's there in Clausewitz too. What Marx brings out of that Hegelian tradition is, of course, an understanding of the whole. That to study any particular part of a problem, you have to understand it in relation to the whole and the totality of the system. And so when studying the question of the role of intellectuals within not just capitalism, but later in a workers' state, you have to then consider their role as connected to the totality being not just the workers' state, but the path to socialism, the path to ultimately communism. And so everything has to be understood in its proper relationship to that process with which we are engaged. So again, one of the key problems of revisionism is that it constantly seeks to undo that crucial element. See, Lenin sees the party in what is to be done. he sees the party in very much in these dialectical terms that he takes from Marx, and of course Marx takes from Hegel, which is that you can't understand, and this is why the bastardizations of Lenin by the bourgeois don't work. The bourgeois and critics always say, "Oh well, you just want an elite imposed upon the workers, and you just want to you're basically Prussians. You want to lead the workers as your army." Now, some have had that point of view, and they've always failed. But the reason why Lenin's Bolshevik Party is so successful is because, as he makes clear in the earliest versions of what is to be done, the vanguard has a constant interaction with the rest of the class. The vanguard is not separate to the rest of the class. It is the leading element, but the vanguard is like the tip of a sword. Like the sword doesn't work without the tip of the sword doesn't work on its own. It doesn't work without the rest of the blade, and it doesn't work without the handle. The working class can be forged into an effective weapon against the ruling class, but it cannot act. The party cannot act without that unity of the class behind it. You cannot overcome capitalism and overcome the bourgeois state with an isolated handful of professional revolutionaries. The professional revolutionaries that Lenin was in favor of the party being composed of will have to be organically linked to the great masses of the proletariat and the peasantry, depending upon the class composition of any given country. And in intellectual terms, if you're not organically linked to the class, if you're not continually interacting with the working class, then you as a vanguard organization, well, you're not the vanguard of anything. You can call yourself a vanguard, but if it's purely intellectual in the sort of narrow sense, and it's not linked to a constant and ongoing interaction and struggle to unify the class behind the idea of that the only way to socialism is to overcome capitalism, to overcome the capitalist state, to build a new state in its place, to smash the old one and build a workers' state as a transitional element that will take us towards socialism. Now, to get to that point, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had to, of course, struggle to attain hegemony within the wider Russian working class and much beyond that into the various different nations that were to make up the USSR. And that took years of constant struggle and trial and error until you reach a point where the party is honed and fine-tuned, shall we say, into the tip of the sword or the tip of the spear, whichever way you want to put it. But it only works if that constant interaction is retained. If it's dropped, if it fails, if the vanguard gets isolated and alienated or just becomes complacent and drops the constant interaction and the renewal of itself that you get through that constant interaction, then you have real problems. Then there lies the path of revisionism. And that is, of course, partly what Gramsci is talking about here, when he's talking about the need for the intellectuals to be organized within the party, and the party to be, of course, constantly renewing itself. And so Gramsci, when he's dealing with the problems of intellectuals, because he sees this in the what I would say is the proper the proper Marxist way, which is that it is understood, the intellectuals are understood by their relationship to not only the means of production, but also that they are understood as all of the intellectual functions that are required for a particular class to exercise its rule. And by understanding that, we can start to understand the role of the party both pre and post-revolution, the way that the building of the state should proceed after the revolution, and the way that the workers' state needs to secure itself, and the way the party needs to constantly contend for the allegiance of the working class, which needs to be won every year by that constant renewal of the organic link between the party and the class, by the renewal of the intellectual layers of the party via new entrants from the working class, and the constant need to struggle for redefining or remaking our ideological training. Our political understanding needs to be constantly honed and reviewed and renewed. And this is all very difficult struggle to do, to carry out. But unless we are doing that in the proper way, then we're not going to succeed. And so an understanding of Gramsci's work on the intellectuals is not only vital for understanding, as I've talked about extensively, the historical formations of the intellectual layers that make up the formation of the bourgeois states. It's also crucial for understanding how we will make communist parties again and anew, and how we will move forward into creating a workers' state, and not only that, securing it in ways that learn from the failures of the past. So I will bring my remarks to a close there and call it a day. This is a slightly untypical episode in that I'm focusing on just one issue, but we'll be back with the sort of general news program tomorrow. So it only remains for me to then just say a typical greeting to those who are in the chat tonight. So we've got James Graham, Jerry, Carmo, Philbin from Rhode Island, USA, Dingo Ate Me Baby, good to see you here, Yuan all the way from Phoenix, Arizona, Tim Gray, CJ from Richmond, Virginia, unused sub from Alicante in Spain. Philbin says, hypocrisy of capitalist intellectuals on full display in the States, suppression of campus free speech meant to divert from Gaza, has enjoyable side effect of them all being exposed as fraudulent. Well, exactly the same here. Well, we'll cover this tomorrow night, but the non-existence of free speech in Europe is particularly marked, shall we say, particularly noticeable. Paul says, hello comrades, great to catch a new live stream again after being away for a few months, traveling and camping. Hope you enjoyed the break, comrade. George Vlad, salut amigo, right back to you. Stanislav Tomov, good evening to you. Paul says, great to have Alex's brain, knowledge, and most of all his excellent ability to analyse from a sincere Marxist perspective to lead us brilliantly. Well, glad you're enjoying it. The whole includes the power, says James Graham, yes. And hello to Morgan. Right, James says 11 out of 10. Well, excellent. I can't argue for better than that. So, thank you to everybody for tuning in tonight. Be sure to join me again tomorrow for an edition of The World Tonight, and that will be at 8 p.m. Now I throw you back over to your brief musical interlude, and you'll be able to find this program in its entirety on the Patreon page. Thank you, and good night.
Poiché